The USS North Carolina, or BB-55 as she was designated by the Navy, is historically significant as being the first of the modern U.S. fast battleships to be built. Commissioned just prior to U.S. involvement in World War II, this tough-as-nails battlewagon earned 15 battle stars while participating in every major campaign of the Pacific War. Now, let's dive into the remarkable history of the USS North Carolina by exploring its construction, World War II service, and her post-war preservation. The North Carolina class, which would consist of 2 ships, North Carolina and her sister Washington, was the first class of U.S. battleships to be built since the completion of the Colorado class in the early 1920s. This was due to the signing of the Washington and London naval treaties during the 1920s and 1930s, which sought to prevent an arms race by limiting capital ship construction among the world's navies. With this new class of battleship, the Navy sought to improve upon the speed and firepower of the previous standard-type battleships of the World War I era. But, with the 35,000-ton limitation imposed by the international treaties, the Navy found it difficult to come up with a design that met all of their desires. Eventually, after considering over 50 different designs, the Navy settled on a design that would produce a speed of 30 knots and have a main battery of 9 14-inch, 50-caliber Mark B guns housed in 3 turrets. These were the same main battery guns used on the New Mexico and Tennessee classes. However, the Secretary of the Navy preferred and decided that a design that featured 12 14-inch guns in quadruple turrets with a max speed of 27 knots was the way to go. Firepower would be prioritized over speed and armor protection. The keel of North Carolina was laid down on October 27, 1937, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. After construction had begun, the United States and Great Britain both invoked the escalator clause of the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936 due to the actions of Germany and Japan. This enabled the U.S. Navy to increase the main batteries of their battleships. Thus, the design of North Carolina's main battery was altered to 9 16-inch, 45-caliber Mark VI guns housed in 3 turrets. North Carolina could hurl a 2,700-pound projectile almost 20 miles with her 16-inch main battery guns. She would also have an incredible secondary punch in the form of 25-inch, 38-caliber dual-purpose guns housed in 10 turrets located amidships, 5 on each side of the ship. These guns would end up being one of the most effective naval weapons of World War II. At this point, North Carolina had a modest amount of mostly ineffective anti-aircraft weapons. This included 1.1-inch, 75-caliber, Chicago pianos, and 50-caliber machine guns. Both of these weapons would prove to be ineffective against air attacks and were later replaced by Bofors 40mm mounts and 20mm Oerlikons, which would become the standard anti-aircraft weapons of the U.S. Navy by 1943. When completed, North Carolina would be over 728 feet long, with a beam slightly over 108 feet and displace 36,600 tons. When fully loaded for combat operations, she would displace almost 45,000 tons. She had an armor belt of 12 inches to protect her vital inner spaces, deck armor of 1.45 inches with 16 inches of armor plating protecting her main battery turrets and barbettes. She was propelled by 4 General Electric geared turbines and 8 Babcock & Wilcox 3-drum express-type boilers that pushed 121,000 standard horsepower to her 4 propeller shafts, which produced a top speed of 28 knots at the time of her commissioning. North Carolina was equipped with the latest radar technology, including the CXAM air search radar upon commissioning. SK and SG air and surface radars were added in late 1942. She would receive electronic and radar upgrades continuously throughout the war. As designed, North Carolina was manned by 108 officers and 1,772 enlisted men. By 1945, with the considerable increase in anti-aircraft armament, the crew size increased to 2,339. This comprised 144 officers and 2,195 enlisted personnel. After the end of the war, the crew was reduced to 1,774. North Carolina would be launched on June 13, 1940, and commissioned on April 9, 1941. After commissioning, North Carolina made her way to the Caribbean for her shakedown cruise and spent the rest of 1941 training and preparing for war. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, North Carolina's crew began preparing for war in earnest. In April of 1942, she would get her first business opportunity when she was ordered to deploy to the North Atlantic for a potential showdown with the German battleship Tirpitz. This showdown never came to fruition, and in mid-1942 the North Carolina was relieved by the battleship South Dakota and made her way to the Pacific Theater of Operations. She passed through the Panama Canal on June 10 and formed up with the aircraft carriers Wasp and Long Island for the final leg to Pearl Harbor, arriving there to much fanfare on July 11, 1942. As the North Carolina entered Pearl Harbor and glided past the burnt-out remains of the Arizona and the capsized Oklahoma, her crew manned the rails in full-dress whites and stood at attention to honor their fallen comrades aboard those ships. As she entered the naval base, all work ceased and celebratory cheers rang out. Ships' whistles blew loudly with excitement. She was the first, new frontline capital ship of many that would enter the harbor over the next few years and was a welcome sight to the many sailors and Marines that had been holding the line in the Pacific since that infamous day in December. North Carolina's first brush with the Japanese would come during the pivotal campaign for the island of Guadalcanal. With the U.S. 1st Marine Division mired in a gruesome, bloody battle on shore, the battleship would escort and protect the vital aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy. It was in this role that she would draw first blood from the Imperial Japanese Navy. On August 24, 1942, the USS North Carolina participated in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. During this battle, while protecting the USS Enterprise, North Carolina shot down her first enemy planes of the war, eventually being credited with downing 7 enemy planes during this action. She also helped shoot down at least 7 other Japanese aircraft, while frustrating the attempts of many more. North Carolina's anti-aircraft was so thick that at one point command aboard the Enterprise radioed her to ask if she was hit and on fire. The answer was negative and that all was well. It was her own guns that were the cause of the smoke they were seeing. On September 15, the North Carolina would face her biggest test yet as she took a torpedo hit to the port bow from the Japanese submarine I-19. The torpedo tore a 32-foot by 18-foot hole in the ship and caused a 5.5-degree list to the port side, along with killing 5 of the ship's crew, which were her first casualties of the war. The torpedo spread fired by the I-19 also got the aircraft carrier Wasp, which was the initial target, and she would have to be scuttled later that evening, and the destroyer O'Brien, which floundered and sank over a month later due to the damage she received from the torpedo strike. North Carolina would find herself back in Pearl Harbor from September 30 to November 17 for repairs. The torpedo strike also caused the ship to not be available to help her sister, the Washington, and the South Dakota, during the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942. Upon returning to the South Pacific after repairs were made, North Carolina would team up with Washington and the two would participate in convoy protection duty for the rest of 1942 and into 1943. The ship would return to Pearl once more in March 1943 for a refit and upgrades. This would last about a month and include the installation of improved radar and fire control equipment. After this, the battleship would join up with the battleships Indiana and Massachusetts for Operation Cartwheel, or the isolation of the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. In September, she would again head back to Pearl Harbor, this time for preparations for the Gilbert Island campaign. This would be when the classic dazzle paint scheme of Measure 32 would be applied to the ship. In the Gilbert Islands campaign, North Carolina would again be protecting the Enterprise along with 2 light carriers. The battleships Indiana and Massachusetts, along with 6 destroyers, would fill out the task group. But on December 8, 1943, North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, Indiana and Massachusetts would be detached from their respective task groups in order to form a battle line under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee. The ships proceeded to bombard the island of Nauru. This battle line would represent the most powerful assemblance of U.S. fighting ships in history to that point. She would then provide air cover for the aircraft carrier Bunker Hill during a series of island strikes later on in December. On January 6, 1944, The Fast Carrier Task Force, or Task Force 58, was established under the command of Admiral Mark Mitcher, with North Carolina being initially assigned to Task Group 58.2 in the primary role as cover for the fleet's carriers. At the end of January and into February 1944, North Carolina participated in the Marshall Islands campaign, which included several shore bombardments and attacks on enemy shipping within the lagoon. During this engagement, she cut loose and sank an enemy cargo ship with her main battery and provided fire support to the Marines and GIs fighting to take the islands. After the conquest of the Marshall Islands, North Carolina, along with Task Force 58, sailed south to assist the U.S. Army with the New Guinea campaign in April. Once again, the battle line would be formed in order to bombard several Japanese strong points. This time period would also see Kingfisher floatplanes from North Carolina attempt a daring rescue of downed U.S. Navy pilots in the surf at Truk in late April. After that, she would make for Pearl Harbor for repairs to a damaged rudder. She returned to Task Force 58 just in time for the Marianas Campaign in June. This campaign would see her screen the fleet's carriers and provide shore bombardment when necessary. North Carolina would participate in the Battle of the Philippine Sea from June 18 through the 19th, as the battle line was formed and placed 15 nautical miles to the west of Task Force 58 with Admiral Lee in command. This was to protect the fleet's western approach from a possible end run by Japanese surface forces while Task Force 58 was attacking the Japanese carriers. After this action, North Carolina remained on station in the Marianas for the next 2 weeks before being dispatched to the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State for an overhaul. North Carolina would return to the fleet in November during the campaign to retake the Philippines. Here she would continue in her screening role for the fleet's carriers and provide valuable support to the kamikaze threat that began to rise at this time. North Carolina would make it through Typhoon Cobra relatively unscathed in mid-December and continue to sortie with the Fast Carrier Task Force into 1945. North Carolina would spend much of 1945 in the same role she had grown accustomed to throughout the war, screening the fleet's valuable aircraft carriers. She would participate in the Iwo Jima and Okinawa landings, along with attacks on the Bonin Islands, Formosa and the Japanese home islands, receiving another overhaul in Pearl Harbor from late April to June. During her time off Okinawa, the North Carolina would shoot down numerous kamikazes. After returning to the fleet in late June, she participated in the numerous air attacks conducted by the Fast Carrier Task Force on the home islands in July. During one of these attacks, the pilot of her Kingfisher floatplane would once again fly into heavy enemy fire in the middle of Tokyo Bay to save a downed U.S. pilot. Following the capitulation of Japan on August 15, 1945, North Carolina would provide men for the initial occupation force and arrive in Japanese home waters herself on August 27. She patrolled the Japanese coast until September 5 when she steamed into Tokyo Bay to pick up the men she had provided during the previous month. On September 6 she was assigned, along with 3 older Standard-type New Mexico-class battleships, 2 light carriers and a destroyer squadron, to Task Force 11 for the return trip to the United States. She would participate in Operation Magic Carpet during her return to the U.S. By war's end, North Carolina had served in every major campaign of the Pacific War and earned 15 battle stars, the most of any U.S. battleship during World War II. She had 10 crewmen killed in action, along with 67 wounded. North Carolina would transition the Panama Canal on October 8, 1945 and arrive in Boston, Massachusetts on October 17. She would undergo one final overhaul and conduct training off of the U.S. East Coast in 1946. North Carolina would be decommissioned on June 27, 1947 and placed in the reserve fleet at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. While the Navy did consider several times to modernize and upgrade her for different uses, they all were eventually seen to be cost-effective, and North Carolina was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1, 1960. As luck would have it, she would be saved from the scrapper by the citizens of the state of North Carolina. A man named James Craig founded a campaign to save the vessel, which was modeled on the Battleship Texas Commission that had successfully acquired and saved the Battleship Texas for preservation as a museum ship. Craig convinced Governor Luther H. Hodges to ask the Navy to delay the scrapping of the ship, and then led a campaign to raise the $250,000 necessary to prepare a site to host the vessel, to tow her there, and work to prepare her for visitors. With the help of the WRAL TV station, which broadcast a "Save Our Ship" advertisement campaign, and numerous state newspapers, Craig was able to secure more than $330,000 for the project, much of which came from school children across the state. On September 6, 1961, North Carolina was transferred to the state, and in late September, she was towed from Bayonne, New Jersey to her new home in Wilmington, North Carolina. She was brought up the Cape Fear River by 9 tugboats, and, as they attempted to turn the ship into her new berth, her stern actually collided with a floating seafood restaurant which was located along the Wilmington waterfront. She was formally opened to the public on April 29, 1962, and is dedicated to the more than 10,000 North Carolinians that gave the ultimate sacrifice during World War II. If you ever get the chance to visit the USS North Carolina in Wilmington, North Carolina, I highly recommend doing so. The ship is in great condition, has been restored to a high degree, and properly shows what a World War II battle wagon was really all about. When I was a young kid, there used to be former members of the ship's crew that would hang around and talk for hours about life aboard and the actions that they were a part of. That is where my appreciation and desire to learn more about the Pacific War began. Sadly, most of them have passed on, but the museum has done a remarkable job preserving their stories and expressing them to the public through many wonderful and thoughtful exhibits located throughout the ship and in the museum. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment and subscribe so that we can bring you more exciting content just like this.